Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's good to be with you here today. We're going to have a unique episode today, but before we get into that, I wanted to make sure you knew about the Patreon. The Patreon is the best way to connect with me. I get lots of listeners commenting in different places, whether Twitter, YouTube, and elsewhere. But if you want direct access, you can sign up on the Patreon, ask me any questions, recommend guests I could have on, articles I should review, videos to interact with. All that good stuff happens on the Patreon. When you sign up at $5 or $15 a month, not only do you get swag, but you also get early access to every episode I release, so you can see it before everybody else. So sign up on the Patreon. It's a great way to support the show, and you can also interact with me anytime you want on the Patreon. I'll put a link to the Patreon in the show notes, so you can go sign up today. $5, $15 a month really helps me out, and let's get into today's episode. Today on the show, we're going to be reading an article from Sola Ecclesia. This is an article I sent to several friends who aren't pastors and can't just read all the time. It's a pretty long article, and they were like, man, I cannot get through this. And so I thought I would do them a favor and do all of you a favor and read this article out loud. Now, a warning, when I read things out loud like this, I typically have a hard time not interrupting myself if I see a good point. So it won't be as clean of a read through as somebody like Aaron Rand or other people who both read and produce their articles in video form. So I'm going to do my best to get through this. It's a pretty long article, and we'll see how much I can get through without taking a break. Anyways, it's a very helpful article. It's titled, Can the Church Talk About Politics? By Brian Laughlin and Doug Ponder. This is published in the journal Sola Ecclesia. I'll put a link to it in the show notes so that you can keep up if you want to go read it or you don't have time to listen to the podcast. But we're talking about in this article, what they're talking about is how the church can engage politically. This is a very important topic right now. This was published August 2nd. I'm recording this October 4th, and it should come out around October 15th. And this audio reading, I asked them for permission to do this. I don't know if they're going to put it on their new podcast. I think they have a new podcast over at Sola Ecclesia or maybe Grimke Seminary. But I thought it was a helpful article, so I wanted to make sure as many people could be exposed to it as possible. And one of the best ways to do that is get it in audio form. So I'm going to read this. They have a caveat in here, and they say this article is lengthy by necessity. This is partly because many Christians, and too many evangelicals in particular, are woefully undereducated in the fields of politics and political theology. So yes, it is lengthy. But with that said, let's get into it. Can the church talk about politics? Brian Laughlin, Doug Ponder, August 2nd, 2024. The answer to the titular question is yes. In fact, the church can't not talk about politics. That's not to say that the church's mission is politics. It isn't. But aspects of the church's mission are political and inescapably so. What's more, the relationship of the church to the world is such that if the church fails to speak to these matters, if the church fails to be the church in all its fullness, then the societies around her will continue their inexorable slide toward the lowest expressions of human nature. As Catholic political philosopher D.C. Schindler explains, a proper integration of the religious dimensions of the city, i.e. the polis, recognizes the presence of God, not only outside, but even more profoundly inside of human activity, informing it, filling it, and illuminating its content and inner meaning. If God is the life of the soul, and the soul the life of the body, then God is the life of the body. Politically speaking, God is the life of the city. If God is excluded from the political as the realization of community, the city will be soulless. Or in fact, because it cannot help but have a soul as a city, it will have something like a functionalized, bureaucratized, immanentized, technologized, mechanized, and so coercively imposed substitute for a soul. In a word, it will turn diabolical. We are witnessing such a diabolical turn in the West, one that can only be halted or reversed by a church fully alive, that is, a church that fully embraces the truth of God's word and its implications for all of life, including the arena of shared public life that is the political domain. Why all people, especially Christians, should care about politics. All human beings, especially Christians, have an indelible duty to rule the world as we subdue and fill the earth for the glory of God and the good of others. This is what makes humans distinct from the animals. It is what people are for. That task of ruling, filling, and subduing the earth is what theologians have called the cultural mandate. And culture includes politics. This is not only because of what politics is, but also because of what politics involves and affects. As Reformed political theorist Johannes Althusius explains, politics is the art of associating men for the purpose of establishing, cultivating, and conserving social life among them. End quote. In other words, politics is the attempt to structure the shared life of human beings in a given society for the benefit of both the individual and the society as a whole. To do this, politics draws upon various fields of knowledge and touches potentially every aspect of life. This is why Aristotle called politics the architectonic art, for it legislates as to what we are to do and we are to abstain from. The end of this science must include those of the others, so that this end must be for the good of man. End quote. All this shows why everyone, especially Christians, should take some interest in politics, for politics directly concerns the practical aspects of life in ways that can significantly improve or diminish the lives of millions. This is why, no matter how well-meaning the speaker might be, it isn't helpful to say things like, quote, no matter who wins the election, Jesus is still on the throne, end quote. Without a doubt, the lordship of Christ is not up for debate. But when the lives or livelihoods of people are at stake, invoking the lordship of Jesus as a kind of placating proverb turns this triumphal truth into a watered-down Christian soup for the soul. Far better to say that because Jesus is Lord, his followers ought to live as such, including, but not limited to, how they think about the ordering of the societies where God's providence has placed them. But some will say, isn't all this the domain of humans in general? Doesn't the church have a distinct mission from that which all humanity is called to do? Or again, since the cultural mandate is a general duty incumbent upon all persons, whether Christian or not, is there not a particular mission for the church that sets her apart from the rest of the world in ways that parallel how humanity is set apart from the rest of the creation? To say that all this another way, if the church has a mission no different from the rest of humanity, then why does the church exist? Politics and the mission of the church. Several years ago, Kevin DeYoung and Greg Gilbert wrote about the mission of the church with a view to some of the things we have been discussing. They argued that while evangelism and discipleship are not the totality of what the church is called to do, they are activities that the church is uniquely called to do. No other organization in the world has been called to make disciples by evangelism, baptism, and catechetical instruction. A few years later, Jonathan Leeman argued a similar position, distinguishing between the church as organized collective, i.e., a local church, and the church as its members, i.e., the persons who belong to such a church. He speaks of a broad and narrow mission for the church. Quote, broadly, Christ authorizes a church as its members with a kingly authority to represent him as God-imaging sons and citizens, whether gathered together or scattered apart. Narrowly, God authorizes a church as organized collective with a distinctly priestly authority to publicly separate sinners from the world and to reconcile to himself and his people through renaming and teaching. End quote. According to Leeman, the broad mission of the church's members is to carry out the various duties incumbent upon all humanity, albeit with the new abilities the Spirit gives to redeemed humanity. But the church's mission in her organized as collective state, that is to say the church's corporate life as a church, is narrower. The gathered church as a body exists to focus exclusively on ecclesial activities such as evangelism, baptism, and discipleship. To be sure, the church does have a distinct mission that sets her apart from the rest of humanity. As DeYoung and Gilbert rightly point out, only the church has been called to make disciples. Yet part of this commission, pause real quick. I agree with that, that the church has, and maybe we're going to see this in the rest of the article, that only the church has been called to make disciples. I think everyone is making disciples. We'll see if they get to this in this article. Yet part of this commission involves discipling all peoples to observe all that I've commanded you, as Jesus said. And quite a lot is contained in that little word all, especially when you include the whole sweep of the scriptures, which were co-authored by the Spirit of Christ himself. Thus, it seems impossible to avoid the conclusion that the church's mission entails a call to teach all that God says, including what God says about justice and the just ordering of public life. For how else can humanity be reformed in the image of our Creator and resume the purpose for which we are created apart from the totality of God's word and all that it addresses? Quote, all of Christ for all of life, end quote, as many have said. This, then, is what we mean by saying the church's mission isn't politics, but is inescapably political in certain respects. We mean that the church's mission is not the ordering of earthly affairs through concrete public policies, politics, yet it does touch on the very foundation of those affairs and directs them to their proper end. To speak plainly, the church's mission is to teach what the Bible says, and the Bible has much to say about how we ought to live together in an ordered society. In other words, the Bible speaks to politics. Yet perhaps some would prefer to speak of the political implications of the church's mission rather than the political dimensions of the church's mission. We grant that, in a vacuum, perhaps political implications is the best way to speak about the church's mission vis-a-vis politics. Nevertheless, we fear that such a way of framing the issue may prove too weak in the minds of many, who would see such implications as remote or non-compulsory, as if the message of the church somehow floated above the earthly affairs of men, with nothing to say to rulers or citizens of societies about justice, neighbor love, or the good life. Compare that way of thinking with the historical effects of the apostles' ministry. In Acts 17, the disciples went to Thessalonica, where they kept announcing the gospel in an effort to make disciples and organize churches. They set the city in an uproar, in part because their message had undeniably political implications. As one among the mob lamented, quote, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus," end quote. We submit that many in the West have lost sight not only of the church's ability but also her duty to live and teach in such a way that produces similar socio-political effects. In addition to misunderstanding what politics is and how the church's mission intrinsically relates to the political, we see three broad areas of grievous misunderstanding that continue to exacerbate the error until once warned about, namely, that great danger of separating our religious convictions from our cultural expression of religion. That is the fatal and great divorce from which the church has suffered so long and so much. End quote. Error 1. We have forgotten the purpose of government. Long before Abraham Kuyper uttered his famous line about every square inch of the world belonging to Christ, the psalmist said, quote, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it," end quote. The apostle adds, quote, "For from him and through him and to him are all things," end quote. These sweeping statements not only assert the Lord's rightful claim upon the world, they also remind us that the Lord, as the Creator, is the source or origin of every good thing. The list of good things that God created includes not only the concept of government, but also the authority to govern. As Paul explains, quote, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God," end quote. In view of this, to resist governing authorities is to resist institutions appointed by God to be a terror to bad conduct. For a governing authority is, quote, "God's minister for your good. He is the minister of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer," end quote. As such, it isn't the church's job to enforce laws and punish criminals. The power of the sword belongs to the state. This distinction is very real and very important, but it is not instituted only as some kind of limitation on the church's authority. These words also lay out a positive vision for what the government actually is and ought to do. The government is the Lord's servant, quote, "sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good," end quote. As such, the governing authorities will answer to God, for they were appointed by him and to serve his broader purposes for humanity. Therefore, it is good and right for Christians to want the government of their nation to reflect what is good according to God. After all, there is no other good than what God says is good. And this is not the much maligned and much misunderstood Christian nationalism that the media have warned you about. This is simply Christians wanting laws that accord with their beliefs, which is, in fact, what all people want. That is why people vote the way they do. It is far more bizarre to imagine a scenario in which Christians know what is good, but don't want laws to reflect this. And yet, that is precisely the situation we increasingly see today. There are many reasons why this is so, but one of them, surely, is as simple as this. We have forgotten that government exists to serve the Lord as his minister, upholding what he says is good. Error 2. We have fallen for the myth of neutrality. The second grievous error afflicting many Christians today is the myth of a neutral public square. It is commonplace nowadays to hear a certain brand of Christian praise the religious pluralism of the modern West, with its competing, even contradictory, religious perspectives held together by its commitment to tolerate such things in the name of free speech and the freedom of expression. No one has made a more thorough defense of such a view than New York Times columnist and confessing Christian David French. In the attempt to remain consistent with his pluralistic principles, French infamously called drag queen story hours one of the blessings of liberty. We are happy to add our names to the myriad of critics who insist that when your conception of the blessings of liberty defends exposing children to something like hyperlink this or this or this or this. I'm assuming these hyperlinks link to perverted drag queen story hours. Then you've lost the plot, which is to say you have forgotten that government was created by God to be his minister, not the minister of coexist bumper stickers. To speak bluntly, godly governments ought to be the ones passing out millstones for drag queen story hour, not permitting such catastrophically vile acts as a blessing of liberty. Once again, the question of how an earthly government can make such judgments comes to the fore. Who's to say what should be promoted, what should be prohibited, and what should be permitted? We have already shown that God is the answer to that question. But it's important to say that there can be no other answer given. This is why the myth of a neutral public square is such a grievous error. For we cannot speak about the common good without some conception of what the good entails. And this is impossible to do without religion. As G.K. Chesterton once said, quote, nothing of importance can be separated entirely from its social effect, which is politics, or from its ultimate value, which is religion, end quote. Similarly, Henry Van Til said, quote, culture is simply the service of God in our lives. It is religion externalized, end quote. He also writes, quote, thus man's morality and economics, his jurisprudence and aesthetics are all religiously oriented and determined, end quote. This is true even for secular states, their spurious claims to religious neutrality notwithstanding. For all governments are tasked with ordering society, and to do so they must make decisions about what is right and wrong, good and evil, worthy of promotion or prohibition. For this reason, the old canard that you can't legislate morality must be thoroughly laid to rest. For, in point of fact, all laws can and do legislate morality. That's quite literally what law is. As D.C. Schindler explains, quote, there is nothing more fundamental to a political community than its laws. We tend to think of these as essentially secular in origin, form, and purpose, and as making absolutely no claim regarding the truth of things. They are merely judicial rules of play. We must admit, though, that deeper questions come into play if the law concerns explicitly some religious or moral matter. But the great legal historian Harold Berman spent a lifetime arguing that law, in fact, ceases to be law because it ceases to hold any authority when it is severed in its exercise, its rituals, its self-understanding, and self-presentation from its original religious dimension. According to Berman, law as law, by its nature, is an expression willy-nilly, whether one likes it or not, of ultimate meaning. End quote. To give a seemingly mundane example, consider the stop sign on the corner near your house. By placing it there, some governing authority determined that all drivers must stop when they come to this particular junction, such that if a driver is caught failing to do so, the law says he must be punished, or may be punished, with a fitting penalty. The appropriateness of enforcing stop signs depends entirely on what they are designed to do, namely to prevent drivers from plowing through a busy intersection where he is likely to strike another vehicle or pedestrian. And the justice of all this depends entirely on the predetermined value of life. For if human life is valuable, then it is worthy of protection, and stop sign laws would be a means to this end. But who says that human life is valuable and worthy of protection? Of course, most people, thank God, grant the value of human life, except when it comes to the lives of the unborn. This juxtaposition demonstrates why the myth of neutrality is indeed a myth. All laws legislate morality. That is their nature and purpose. It is impossible, therefore, to have laws with a neutral stance toward competing religious views or philosophies of life. The very decision to promote, prohibit, or permit some act, like abortion, is a decision that is always made in view of some ultimate truth. In other words, all governments have a god of the system, an ultimate and transcendent reference point. The only question is whether governments recognize and are honest about the particular god they are beholden to. And if Christians are right about the identity of Jesus Christ, and they are, then there are only two options. A government is either beholden to the Lord of the universe, or else it is beholden to some other false god and rival claimant to his throne. Thus there is no neutral public square. Whoever is not with Christ is against him. Error 3. We have truncated the gospel. The third and final grievous error afflicting the minds of many Christians at this moment is related to the gospel. This error may be the most serious and far-reaching of the three, for the gospel is at the very heart of Christianity. Yet for all the talk of the gospel and of gospel centrality, there remains a concerning confusion about what exactly the gospel is. For his part, the late Timothy Keller rightly pointed out that the gospel is good news, its literal meaning, not good advice. That is to say, the gospel is a message about Jesus and what he has done to reconcile us to God. not a message about what we must do in order to reconcile ourselves to God from whom we are estranged. So far, so good. But many of the gospel-centered types seem to have in mind some message other than one that our Lord and his apostles preached. Jesus repeatedly preached about his authority as the king of God's kingdom, even saying this was the reason why he was sent. And doing so, he was not announcing something entirely new so much as instantiating something very old. Specifically, the entire life and ministry of Jesus was a demonstration of the fact that the God who made us also reigns over us in every conceivable way. Quote, God reigns over the nations, the psalmist says. Quote, he sits on his holy throne. Quote, the Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble, the psalmist adds in another place. This same song is the one sung by the redeemed at the end of the age in Revelation, and critically, it is this message that Isaiah made beautiful upon the mountains the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who proclaims salvation to Zion, saying, quote, your God reigns. In other words, the gospel is the good news that Jesus Christ and nobody else, thank God, is Lord. Indeed, this message, Jesus is Lord, was a central kerygma of the early church. What makes that message good news is, of course, the kind of Lord that Jesus is, powerfully demonstrated in his willingness to submit himself to the point of death on the cross for our sakes, on the way to his rightful exaltation above all things. This biblical framing avoids truncating the gospel to the good news of forgiveness alone, which, while utterly necessary and even central, is not the totality of our problem nor the fullness of God's solution. To say the same thing another way, salvation is more than justification, and the good news of what Jesus has done for us is much greater than this too. He came to set right all that we put wrong, including all that rulers and authorities put wrong too. He comes to make his blessings flow as far as the curse is found, as Isaac Watts reminds us. And Paul insists that it's in this hope that we are saved. We are speaking then of the good news that God made us and made us his. The good news of God's persistent grace through the fall of man into sin, the good news of Jesus' life, death, resurrection for us, and the good news of his return to renew all things. All this is the gospel, and anything short of this fulsome announcement makes the good news a little less good. To be sure, the cross is the center of this redemptive work, the sine qua non of our redemption. But when we limit the concerns of God to the forgiveness of individual sinners, we truncate not only the gospel, but the character of God himself. We make him out to be someone who doesn't not really care whether nations are ordered in such a way that greater neighbor love results, so long as individuals within that nation are going to heaven. For such people, it's as if what Jesus meant when he taught us to pray, quote, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven, end quote, was something like, your forgiveness come, your will be done, in our personal devotion and private religious expression. That's a great point. I might borrow that one day. Back into the article. That is how you fill a nation with people who say, quote, it doesn't matter whether you vote to support abortion or not, that's not a gospel issue, end quote. And though many Christians would rightly be horrified by such a statement, they inadvertently produce the same effect in others when they say things like, quote, don't worry about politics, just preach the gospel, end quote, in response to any Christian calls to action in the political domain. To many unsuspecting persons, such statements have the ring of truth about them because they mention words like preach and gospel with their positive connotations in opposition to politics with all of its negative connotations. But that entire way of thinking is far afield from the Apostle Paul. His gospel announced to the Roman Empire that there was another king who commanded our allegiance such that some of Caesar's decrees should be ignored or resisted. Not only that, but after defending the use of the law and alluding to 9 of the 10 commandments in order, Paul declares that the moral law, with its prohibition of murder and sexual immorality and all the rest, is, quote, sound teaching that conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God, end quote. Therefore, to say anything like, quote, just preach the gospel and don't worry about politics, end quote, is to truncate the message and implications of the gospel to an extent that falls short of the biblical description of the same, for it pits the gospel against the God-intended effects of the gospel. A further problem with this way of thinking, in addition to its truncation of the good news and its manifold implications for all of life, is that it's utterly short-sighted. Suppose that the church and a particular nation were to achieve some great level of success in her evangelistic efforts, such that a majority of the population were now professing Christians. That nation will still need laws. It will still have to decide how best to organize the people's common life. And this is politics. Should not the scriptures be the guide here as well? Do they not teach unchanging truths as well as principles and norms that can inform something like a Christian approach to the political realm? Or is the gospel the only concern of God within the whole Bible? With all this talk about politics, you may have something else on your mind. You may be thinking historically, whether it's the American Revolution or the British Empire or the Roman Republic. Well, friends, I have a great opportunity for you. You can head over to Hillsdale, and they offer free online classes for your enrichment on these various topics. Everything from C.S. Lewis to the American founding to the Roman Republic. You can go to Hillsdale's online courses, 40 free online courses on some of the most important subjects today. If you're a guy, you have the Roman Republic on your mind, you're thinking about the fall of the Roman Empire, just as we might be witnessing the fall of the American Empire today. I still need to do an episode on the American Empire, what it is not, with Josh Abatoy. But back into what we're talking about. Hillsdale College's online courses are all free. They're self-paced. You can sign up today. It's world-class faculty up there. And so, my favorite that I've taken is The Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic. If you're a podcast listener, you know this. And so you can self-pace these courses. They're great to start whenever, wherever, so you can become more educated. Go to hillsdale.edu/proof to enroll. There's no cost. It's really easy to get started. That's hillsdale.edu/proof. Register today to let them know that I sent you at hillsdale.edu/proof. Let's get back into today's episode. Answering objections to Christian political engagement. A number of objections come up in response to what we've been saying. Here are several of the most common we have encountered. The pietistic objection. The Bible is not political, it's spiritual. Or, Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. Or, it's not our job to influence culture, it's just our job to evangelize and make disciples. There are some who do not see in the pages of Scripture anything like a political theology. One reason for this is a failure to account for the fact that the New Testament was written during a period of history when the average Roman citizen, much less the non-Roman subjects of the empire, had virtually no say in how their society was governed. Hence, Paul never says anything about voting because there was no voting to be had. But once the gospel took root in various societies around the world, you consistently find Christians encouraging the people of God to use righteous means at their disposal for the stability and benefit of the place where they lived. Others within this group are sometimes inclined to think that the Bible expresses an anti-political theology that encourages Christians not to worry about earthly affairs, even if they can vote, and to keep their eyes exclusively fixed on heaven and the salvation of the lost. As justification for this way of thinking, some have said things like, "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through." There's a kernel of truth here. This world in its current state is not our home, but this world in its reconciled and to be renewed form is our home indeed. To be sure, we confess that the ultimate responsibility and authority and ability to fix the world rest in God's hands. No Christian denies this, but the Lord uses means, and some Christians selectively pretend that this is not so. They will insist on the importance of preaching the gospel as the means to save the lost, for example, while ignoring the place of means in the work of ordering society towards justice and the good life. To make matters worse, pietistic evangelicals are hypocritical on this point. Some have lauded the effects of efforts of Christians like William Wilberforce in outlawing the slave trade in Britain, and even hosted whole conferences devoted to Martin Luther King Jr.'s part in ending segregation in America. But when you ask whether Christians today should make it their aim to render certain evils illegal in America, the pietist suddenly retreats to the singular work of saving souls. Quote, "Christ's kingdom is not of this world," end quote, he reminds us. Never mind that scholars for centuries have pointed out that Christ's words in John 18:36 concern the origin of his kingdom, not its divinely appointed destination, which is the earth. The real problem is the hypocrisy that celebrates Christian political action by some and demonizes it by others. This is so common that I, Doug, have created what I call the MLK test, which is designed to root out the double standard, weights and measures of this hypocritical pietism. For example, if it was good that Martin Luther King Jr. helped to end segregation through preaching and political action, and not through preaching alone, then it would also be good to employ political means to end things like abortion, gay marriage, drag queen story hours, so-called sex reassignment surgeries, unjust tax laws, illegal immigration, etc. The legalistic objection. Quote, "Laws can't change hearts, only the gospel can do that. Therefore, passing laws to regulate a person's behavior is legalistic and ineffectual." End quote. People who think that laws equal legalism clearly have not read the Bible, whose authors routinely praise the goodness of God's laws. They also seem to forget that Jesus said the fundamental duty of mankind consists in the laws to love God and love one's neighbor as oneself. Furthermore, he said that obedience to his commands was an indicator of our love for him. So let us have done with the laws our legalistic mindset. A more sophisticated form of the legalist objection takes a quasi-Lutheran view of the law, which treats law as something wholly negative, or thus incapable of changing human behavior. Yet we call this a quasi-Lutheran view of the law because even Luther, who at times seemed reticent about the normative or didactic use of the law, still affirmed what is called the civil or political use of the law, usus politicus, to restrain evil behavior. This objection is related to the claim that laws can't legislate morality. We won't insult the reader's intelligence by repeating the preceding discussion that all laws already do this, whether we like it or not. Instead, we'll quote Martin Luther King Jr. on this point. Quote, "If the problem is to be solved, then, in the final sense, hearts must be changed. Religion and education must play a great role in changing the heart, but we must go on to say that behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me. And I think that is pretty important also." End quote. King's statement reflects the biblical truth that law, by virtue of its threats and punishment, can and does restrain evil men from acting even worse than they might otherwise have done. To give a modern example, it's true that outlawing the Orwellian named gender-affirming care cannot change a person's darkened heart. Only the gospel can do that. But it can keep them from irreparably mutilating a child's genitals. And we think that's pretty important also. The cultural Christianity is bad objection. If you try to have a Christian culture without actual Christians, it will inoculate people to the gospel or hinder the witness of the church. End quote. This objection is as bad as it is common. Suppose that you have 5 children still living under your roof. Suppose that one of them has made it quite clear that he is not a Christian. While you and your spouse may have different expectations of that child's desire and ability to behave, you will not have different rules for governing his behavior. The child still has to honor his father and mother. He still is not permitted to harm his siblings. He is not allowed to watch porn or bring his girlfriend over to sleep with her. He is not allowed to steal from others. He will be punished for lying or cheating on his homework, and so forth. Quote, "You shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God." End quote. It would be the height of insanity to think, as so many Christians now do, that imposing good laws on someone who does not agree with them, like the child in the example above, is injurious to their soul. In reality, the opposite is the case. The failure to help such a person see that they are in the wrong leaves in their soul in jeopardy of damnation. Even so, some Christians are worried that a society that adopts an explicitly Christian framework for its laws and customs runs the double risk of inoculating individuals to the gospel and polluting the witness of the church. We are sympathetic to these concerns, and there are genuine examples of these realities. Think of someone in Britain, for example, who might have been baptized into the Church of England and who grew up in a culture where to be British is to be Anglican, even if she herself neither believes nor practices what the church teaches. Such a person who is tragically far from hypothetical is very much in danger of presuming that, if there is a God at all, she will be on God's good side because of her nominal Christian status. These concerns have received fresh relevance following the recent trend of high-profile figures, for example Elon Musk, Jordan Peterson, Richard Dawkins, and Peter Thiel, who have adopted the label cultural Christian to describe their affinity to Christian values despite their unbelief in the Christian God. Many of these figures have done so in response to progressivism's anti-culture of death works. Others have done so in response to the troubling advance of Islam with its anti-Western militarism. What is the church to think about these cultural Christians? We think the Lord would look at these people and say, quote, "You are not far from the kingdom of God," end quote. In any case, we are hard-pressed to see how it is bad for a society that influential public figures are waking up to the wisdom of God's laws. While their own souls may be in jeopardy, it is foolish to celebrate the demise of Christian culture, as some have done, for the loss of Christian values, beliefs, and customs, even among those who may have individually been hypocritical toward the same, creates a cultural vacuum that is filled with something infinitely less good than the design of God. The separation of church and state objection. Quote, "What about the separation of church and state?" End quote. The objection overlooks 2 pieces of data, one theological and one historical. As for the latter, this objection mischaracterizes American history. In the first place, the phrase, quote, "separation of church and state," end quote, is not a constitutional phrase. Instead, it comes from Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut. A deeper than Reddit level reading of this document shows that it was written to address the religious liberty of Baptists in a formally non-Baptist state. The founders were concerned with the with preserving a diversity of religious expression that made room for various Christian denominations, not one that shrugs at sodomy in the name of religious tolerance. This is actually a very side note. This is a very important topic. When we speak about religious liberty, we should always go back to what they intended religious liberty to be for. The founders and others would not have conceived of religious liberty for Mohammedans, for example. Back to the article. They certainly did not intend to exclude the influence of religion on public life, as virtually all public discourse from that time until the early 20th century shows. To give but one example, Abraham Lincoln's Proclamation 97 appointing a day of national humiliation, fasting, and prayer includes these words, quote, "Whereas the Senate of the United States, devoutly recognizing the supreme authority and just government of Almighty God in all the affairs of men and of nations, has by a resolution requested the President to designate and set apart a day for national prayer and humiliation, and whereas it is the duty of nations as well as of men to own their dependence upon the overruling power of God, to confess their sins and transgressions in humble sorrow, yet with assured hope that genuine repentance will lead to mercy and pardon, and to recognize the sublime truth announced in the Holy Scriptures and proven by all history, that those nations are only blessed whose God is the Lord. And, insomuch as we know that by his divine law nations, like individuals, are subjected to punishments and chastisements in this world, may we not justly fear that the awful calamity of civil war, which now desolates the land, may be but a punishment inflicted upon us for our presumptuous sins, to the needful end of our national reformation as a whole people. It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended power, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness. Now, therefore, in compliance with the request and fully concurring in the views of the Senate, I do by this my proclamation designate and set apart Thursday, the 30th of April, 1863, as a day of national humiliation, fasting, and prayer. And I do hereby request all the people to abstain on that day from their ordinary secular pursuits, and to unite at their several places of public worship and their respective homes in keeping the day holy to the Lord, and devoted to the humble discharge of the religious duties proper to that solemn occasion." End quote. Say what you will about the prudence of Lincoln's politics and other arenas, he clearly did not see the much touted separation of church and state in the same terms as most moderns. Besides all this, even if there were a nation whose constitution did aim to prohibit the influence of religion in the political sphere, such an approach fails for two reasons. In the first place, we have already shown that law is essentially and inescapably metaphysical because all laws make or reflect value judgments about what is good. Thus, all law is religious at some level. Second, all governing authorities receive their authority to govern from God. As such, it would be prudent for them to acknowledge the Creator to whom they will be accountable. The pastoral vocation objection. Quote, "Although politics is and ought to be influenced by religion, politics is not the domain of pastoral authority. Pastors should stick to the care of souls." End quote. We are sympathetic to this objection in a couple of respects. In the first place, it is true that the pastoral vocation is the care of souls, and as such, the primary focus of pastoral ministry is and ought to be the spiritual domain of life. But this is not as neat and tidy as some make it out to be. As the leaders charged with speaking the words of God to their people, by preaching the whole counsel of God in order to teach the nations to obey all that Jesus commanded, how can pastors not address the political realm whenever the truths of Scriptures inform these realities at some level? Nevertheless, we acknowledge that much of what constitutes politics proper concerns the prudential implementation of specific laws and policies aimed at achieving concrete ends. To speak plainly, politics is not merely about ordering society towards some good, for example, protecting the unborn, but about the best course of action to do so in a particular time and place. Some of these policy considerations go far beyond the timeless principles articulated in scriptures. For example, a pastor could not be expected to have a fully formed opinion on, say, the Chevron doctrine. Yet, other political matters are so closely connected to the teaching of the scriptures that the failure of the pastor to address them would amount to an abandonment of his calling. As such, those who insist that politics, in the most technical sense, is not the domain of pastors would seem to undermine much more than they mean to exclude. To give an example of what we have in mind when we refer to the responsibility of pastors to preach the truth of God's word with a view to its range of implications, including political implications, consider what the founding father John Adams once wrote. Quote, It is the duty of the clergy to accommodate their discourses to the times, to preach against such sins as are most prevalent, and to recommend such virtues as are most wanted. For example, if exorbitant ambition and venality are predominant, ought they not warn their hearers against these vices? If public spirit is much wanted, should they not inculcate this great virtue? If the rights and duties of Christian magistrates and subjects are disputed, should they not explain them, show their nature, ends, limitations, and restrictions, how much soever it may move the gall of Massachusetts? End quote. The instrumentalization of the church objection. Quote, the church does not exist for the sake of politics. Politics exists for the sake of the church. End quote. By far the most serious objection is reflected in the concern that framing the church's mission in political terms at any level runs a serious risk of turning the church into the means of some lesser temporal end. In other words, there is a way of doing church that makes it seem as if the church exists for the sake of earthly societies, subordinating her eternal mission to some temporal earthly good. We reject the instrumentalization of the church in this fashion, and we deny that evangelism and discipleship exist solely for the sake of politics or the temporary betterment of society. However, it seems to us that while this error is possible, it is actually less common than its opposite. That is to say, far more Christians are in danger not of collapsing the church's mission into politics, but of collapsing politics into the mission of the church. One scholar has written a great deal on this danger is Redeemer University professor James R. Wood. In a series of well-written but much misunderstood articles, Wood has shown that many Christians have come to conceive of politics as a form of evangelism. Wood writes, quote, Keller's winsome approach led him to great success as an evangelist, but he also, maybe subconsciously, thinks about politics through the lens of evangelism, in the sense of making sure that political judgments do not prevent people in today's world from coming to Christ. His approach to evangelism informs his political writings and his views on how Christians should engage politics. End quote. Conceived in this way, certain Christians, especially those who have been influenced by Keller's third way, tend to think of political engagement not in terms of what is best for order in society to the good, but in terms of which political policies are least likely to offend those who are not Christian. This strips politics of its proper domain, turning it into something like apologetics, where the actual content and likely outcome of particular political policies are not weighed against what God says is good, but against what culture will perceive to be nice or non-threatening. For example, in his New York Times article, quote, how do Christians fit into the two-party system? They don't, end quote. The late Tim Keller completely fails to mention the infanticide of the unborn, a sin that warranted the death penalty in Israel, and which incurred his nation-ending wrath, and which formed the biblical imagery for hell itself. We do not wish to speculate as to why Keller did not mention abortion in his article, but given the particular subject matter, it seems like the kind of omission one would make if he conceived of political engagement as an evangelistic endeavor, and thus wanted to minimize offense to non-Christians who overwhelmingly endorse abortion as a right. This is what Joe Rigney has called the idol of prophetic credibility. Yet, as Wood explains in another article, quote, politics is not about minimizing offense in order to maximize openness to the evangelistic message. Politics is, rather, focused on the pursuit of justice and the just ordering of society. End quote. That's simply what politics is. To make it anything else strips the political of proper domain in God's economy and jeopardizes the real temporal good that could be accomplished for fear that some, for example non-Christians, would find the church's political activity a hindrance to the gospel. To speak plainly, the evangelical church is in danger of not passing policies that would better love our neighbors because of their desire to be seen as kind, unoffensive, and non-threatening to certain political powers. To give a contemporary example, when an American Christian goes into the voting booth every November, he is not there to pass whatever policies he thinks would paint the church in a favorable light to the watching world. Rather, he is there to vote for prudent policies that direct the earthly affairs of his nation in accordance with what he knows to be true, good, and on the basis of the Word of God. So he votes against politicians who celebrate the destruction of babies in the womb or who eagerly endorse transitioning young children barely old enough to know what sex is. One need not be a Christian to see the wrongness of those and others and other courses of action, but it is difficult to see how a Christian could not see the rightness of these matters, unless they have been duped into thinking that politics is about showing the world that Christianity is not offensive. The third way objection, quote, the gospel is neither right nor left, or The church is prophetic, not partisan, or we follow not the elephant or the donkey, but a slain lamb, or truth over tribe, end quote. Mantras like these are repeated ad nauseum nowadays, even by those who ought to know better. Megachurch pastors seem especially prone to speaking in these ways. Several hyperlinks are included in the article. But they're not the only ones to blame. These statements contain just enough truth to seem plausible, but what really makes them attractive is that they enable Christians, whether they realize it or not, to avoid the sort of prophetic denunciations that will lose respect in the eyes of the world or worldly people. For example, it's true that the gospel is neither right nor left. The gospel simply is what it is. But it's also true that the scriptural teachings on sex, marriage, abortion, the body, and a litany of other issues will place Western Christians to the right of most politicians. And it's true that the church is not prophetic, or the church is prophetic, not partisan, that she follows neither the Republican elephant nor the Democratic donkey in the American context. She follows the slain lamb. But that lamb who was slain is the Lord of the cosmos, and he made his concerns known to us in the scriptures. To whatever degree these concerns are shared by the donkey or the elephant, we should rejoice. But when they are not, such slogans dull the edge of truth in an hour of real need, discouraging Christian political action that could literally save lives, preserve godly liberty, and improve the ability of honest people to maintain their livelihood. At their best, the aforementioned statements reflect a sincere attempt to safeguard the church's prophetic truth-telling ministry from being corrupted and instrumentalized for exclusively political ends. This is good and right. In actual effect, however, these slogans gloss over significant political differences, establishing a false moral equivalence and obscuring the God-given duties of every person, including every Christian, to promote the good and restrain evil in their society, including through political means. To make matters worse, many American Christians repeat these mantras at precisely a time when one of the two major political parties has departed from basic biology, sexual sanity, transcendent morality, and many other truths and values of Christianity. We're talking about a political party that wants to restore the right for parents to kill their unborn children, including up to the moment of birth, while repeatedly deceiving others about their actual position. They also lie about basic biological facts in order to defend their killing of the unborn. The same political party celebrates and normalizes sexual deviancy at great risk to society, includes support for gay marriage in their official platform, pushes Transgender Day of Visibility as a national day of observance, permits the vice president to appear publicly on televised drag shows, backed congressional bills that would allow men to compete in women's sports and enter women's locker rooms, secretly pushed to remove age limits for trans surgery, who publicly argue that men can get pregnant and prefer to speak of persons with a capacity for pregnancy instead of mothers. And not content to stop there, the Democratic Party appoints sexual deviants to prominent national positions. A man who thinks he's a woman as the assistant health secretary, appointing a non-binary drag queen who was later caught after multiple felony theft attempts as the head of the energy department, a lesbian woman as a White House press secretary, a queer supporter of Palestinian terrorism to the associate communications director of the White House, and several congressional aides who have been caught making amateur gay porn in official government buildings. It should go without saying, but as Orwell said, quote, "We have now sunk to a depth at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent men," end quote. The obvious point being that people who normalize sexual deviancy and believe that men can become women and vice versa have departed from both morality and reality to such a degree that their conclusions on all other matters should be treated with nothing short of the highest levels of skepticism. The Democratic Party has also thrown its support behind the openly Marxist Black Lives Matter organization, which from the start has been unapologetically feminist, womanist, and queer. Democratic politicians also fomented rioting in the wake of George Floyd's death, calling violence and the destruction of property mostly peaceful protests that are not going to let up, and they should not let up, as Vice President Kamala Harris has said. All this despite the fact that minority-owned businesses were destroyed at disproportionate levels by the rioting in the name of racial justice. And sidebar from this, Tim Walz is the guy who was overseeing Minneapolis and Minnesota at the time, and now he is the vice president candidate for the Democratic Party. It's wild to me that anybody would look at him as a viable VP pick. Anyways, various leaders of the Democratic Party also lied, acted hypocritically, and promoted harsh and ineffective measures during the COVID-19 years. And it wasn't just elected representatives and appointed officials. Alarming numbers of Democratic voters supported draconian measures against the unvaccinated. wanting the government to track their movements with digital devices, 47%, to fine them, 55%, to lock them in their homes, 59%, or quarantine internment camps, 45%, or even take their children away from them, 29%. And what more shall we say? For time would fail us to speak of the defense of attempts to force Christians to violate tenets of their faith, the promotion of DEI policies that judge people by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character, the passing of laws that prevent parents from being informed about their children's decision to transition genders and make it possible for children to be taken from parents, the push to relabel pedophiles as minor attracted persons, the opposing of strict penalties for child sex offenders, and other deeply concerning moves. Against this backdrop, you can see why saying the gospel is neither right nor left in 2024 is simply misleading to the point of being harmful. And yes, we know that the Republican Party is far from perfect and that Donald Trump is no saint, to put it mildly. To give it a recent example, the GOP has softened its stance on abortion and same-sex marriage, but these stooges still affirm basic biology and still know that 2 + 2 = 4, not 5, and still have more Christians and more favorable views of Christianity than the other major political party. Simply put, as flawed as both parties are, there is not a moral equivalence between them. This isn't the 90s anymore, where Bill Clinton, with his balanced budget, his Defense of Marriage Act, his prohibition of openly gay members in the military, and his tough stances on crime, welfare, and illegal immigration, was arguably more conservative than Donald Trump in 2024. In that time, the debates mainly focused on the best means to achieve mostly agreed upon ends. But those days are long gone, and the time has come for the people of God to wake up and see the cultural revolution in their midst and to do something about it. How then should we vote? We do not think that politics is the only, nor even the most significant activity for Christians to engage in. However, political engagement does afford Christians a low-cost, high-impact means for influencing their societies towards what God says is good for everyone. So, in light of the general duty that God has given all people, especially Christians, to regard their neighbor's well being and to exercise benevolent dominion over the world, pietistic political apathy is not an option for Christians so long as our voice and our votes stand a real chance of doing significant good. We know it is tempting for pastors to fly above the fray, preaching a cruising altitude Jesus that never touches down with specificity anywhere near what we see in the scriptures. But that course of action is partly, though far from wholly, why the West now finds itself in the mess that it's in. As theologian Peter Leithart explains, quote, for about a millennium, Christianity permeated the political life of Western Europe. Western Europe was Christendom, Christ's realm. Kings took oaths to the triune God at coronations and thought about the implications of the Ten Commandments for developing laws. If religion were going to be excluded from political life, it had to be turned into something that was not inherently political. It had to be spiritualized. Surprisingly, the Christians who have been the most eager to follow this program are not liberals and virtual unbelievers, but conservative Bible-believing Christians. While many liberals have substituted politics for faith, many Bible-believing Christians have often dispensed with the political dimensions of their faith altogether. End quote. Consider this. Even the Amish are rallying to vote against the transgressive madness all around us. Historically, this group has been loath to involve themselves in the temporal affairs of the state, so it's worth asking, why are they doing so now? In fact, we would suggest that if a pastor finds himself further removed from the political realm than the famously separatist Anabaptist, he is overdue for some serious self-reflection. We know that other Christians with tender hearts may feel overwhelmed by the insanity of the West. It is tempting for them to bury their heads and retreat to the shires of their homes. But without taking action while they can, their little shires won't remain untouched for long. For the developments we have highlighted in this article are not radical outliers held by a fringe group of people. On the contrary, most organizations today are overwhelmingly progressive. Federal employees overwhelmingly donate to progressives. Most, 70% of America's GDP belongs to counties that break for progressives. The people who educate the next generation, for example, public school teachers and university instructors, strongly lean progressive. The vast majority of tech companies who make our most used products, produce our entertainment, and design all social media algorithms are run by progressives. The journalists who report and interpret the news, including many professing Christian journalists, donate extensively to progressives. In other words, virtually all the most powerful cultural shapers in the West are alike in their efforts to contravene objective truths and Christian values that have long benefited society. Recognizing this does not mean that we think voting for anti-progressive policies is enough to win the day in the end. It isn't. You can't make America Christian again by politics. But this does not mean that politics doesn't matter at all. As we've already shown throughout this article, your vote has a real impact on the lives of the people around you. It can slow or hasten the legal and social contagion of secular pro-abortion, pro-LGBTQ, anti-Christian progressivism. And that matters. For, quote, when the wicked increase, transgression increases, end quote, as Proverbs warns us. And, quote, when the wicked rule, the people groan, end quote. In light of this, your duty as a Christian is to preach the gospel and do good works. But your duty as a citizen is to vote in such a way that civil wickedness does not increase transgression or bring even more suffering, whether through open immorality or the targeted destruction of basic societal norms like male-female, the two-parent family, proper love for one's country, and private industry job creation. In conclusion, you aren't and never will be voting for Jesus. And yes, he'll still be on the throne no matter what happens in November. But because he's on the throne, you should both preach the gospel and, quote, do all good that you can do by all the means you can, and all the ways you can, and all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can, end quote, including by voting for the candidate whose policies most reflect, however imperfectly, all that Christ has commanded us. All right, that's the end of the article. There are a bunch of footnotes at the end of the article. And like I said, I'll put a link to this in the show notes. So if you found my reading helpful or unhelpful, you can still reference the article over at Sola Ecclesia titled, Can the Church Talk About Politics? Well, thanks for joining me today for this reading of the article from Sola Ecclesia. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, share it with a friend. I think this is a great article, great conversation starter, could make for a great men's study if you wanted to get together with other guys and discuss it. But share the episode with a friend. Give it a great rating on iTunes and Spotify and anywhere else podcasts are found. That way people can find me. It's the best way people can find me. Also on YouTube, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you can get notified at any time a new video gets released. And you can also leave a comment, like, share there, interact as much as possible so that way more people can hear some of the great content that I try to bring to you. I also wanted to make sure you knew about a great product that I use that you probably heard about before on the podcast called Ion Layer. Ion Layer is a really innovative technology that helps people with their energy, with their muscle recovery, with their stamina, with their mental acuity. Ion Layer has designed a patch that can go on your skin that replaces an IV drip that a lot of people use for NAD plus supplements. You're probably asking, what is NAD plus supplements? Well, friend, they are very important for all the things I mentioned before, mental acuity, recovery after workout, all that good stuff. By the time you're 50, your NAD levels are about 50% of what they used to be in their 20s. That's why it can be so hard to recover after a workout. You slap one of those patches on for 14 hours, and it gets those NAD plus doses into your system so that you can recover faster. It's really easy to do. They have a doctor in-house where they can consult with you, and once you get approved, 5 to 7 days later, your NAD Plus kit will arrive at your door. So you can get $100 off your first Ion Layer NAD Plus kit with code FPT if you head over to ionlayer.com. Use code FPT, get $100 off your first kit. These are incredibly affordable compared to the thousands of dollars you would spend at a place like Restore or other places where you would get an NAD Plus treatment. So go over to ionlayer.com, use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. If you are unhappy with it, if it's not doing what I think it does, which I know it does because I've used it, then there's a 30-day 100% money back guarantee. So it's really a no-brainer if you're looking to supplement, if you care about your health, which if you listen to my podcast, you probably do. Head over to ionlayer.com, use code FPT, get $100 off your first kit today. Well, thanks so much for joining me for the episode. I hope you're having a great time. And like I said, subscribe and make sure you're signing up wherever you can. Give it a great rating on iTunes, Spotify, all that. And we will see you next time.